Welcome, welcome, welcome to the Wild Yoga Tribe podcast. I'm your host, Lily Allen Duenas. Together we'll talk about the world of yoga and we'll talk to people from around the world. Before diving into the episode, I wanted to invite you to head on over to my website, wildyogatribe.com. I would really love for you to give it a look as I just launched a new website and I would love to hear what you think of it. Feel free to reach out on social media wherever makes the most sense for you. Also, if you're a longtime listener, I wanted to say thank you for your continued support. And if you feel called, I'd be honored if you left a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you tune into the show. Ready to dive in? Let's get started. Namaste, family, and welcome back to the Wild Yoga Tribe podcast. Today, I am so excited to welcome Nicola Barnes onto the podcast today. She's a yoga teacher from Vanuatu, and she's also the co-founder of the leading yoga association in Vanuatu. It's donation-based, and it has been for 13 years. And while Nicola has been a yoga teacher for 19 years, I'm so excited to learn more about the Yoga Association and how yoga came into her life and all there is to know about Nicola Barnes. So thank you so much for being with me here today on the show.
Thank you, Lily. It's a pleasure. I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you. So let's get started talking about how you first heard about yoga. How did it come into your life and get on your radar?
Okay, I think the most meaningful start to yoga and I was when I was living in London. So in the late 1990s, early 2000s, I lived in London. And it was a kind of hectic life, which it is, I think, for many people. I was in a very corporate job. And I was very much a seeker. So I was looking into Buddhism. I was realizing that at that stage in my life, there was something that was missing. And I found a yoga class that was very everyday sort of setting. It was actually in a room above a public swimming pool in the center of London. And I just connected with the classes and immediately became a very regular student and very inspired by the style of yoga. It was a teacher who had been taught the Seven Under style. And she was very strong and very practical and very grounded. And I just immediately took to the yoga. So with that, there were some other things that perhaps were part of my introduction into the love of it. I remember as a child, my mum had books about yoga in probably the 60s and 70s, and I used to be very intrigued at looking, but that was very without understanding. So there was a connection in London, and at that stage, it kicked off searching for a different type of life. I was looking for something. And yoga then became part of that something. So I traveled to India and did my teacher's training in India. And from that moment forward, I had a real connection with a few of the teachers there, had some very interesting conversations about life and meaning in life and those things that bring us such groundedness and joy. And from then on in, I've taught as a part of my life. I'm a teacher that I'm very multifaceted. I don't teach yoga as a full-time job. It's a part of my life. It's part of the whole. So it's a petal in the flower.
Amazing. I also love to learn too, Nicole, that your mother had books on yoga. Was she practicing or was it more just like part of the library?
I think it was more part of the library because she has not really practiced at all. And I've tried to encourage her to do different bits and pieces. And interesting, it's my dad who's connected a bit with me through yoga every now and again, but not my mum. No, I think it was part of the maybe hippie culture of the 70s. It was one of those books that was there along with the incense and the bits and pieces, but she doesn't have a strong connection. But what I have loved about yoga is ever since I lived in London, I've found just the most amazing opportunities through yoga around the world. At the time when I was learning, I had a bit of a crazy work life. I worked a lot in Botswana. I was working in Africa. And I had a connection with an African woman at my workplace. And she said to me one day, bring a change of clothes. I'm going to take you to do something with me that no one else will come with me. And this was an African woman. We were of similar age. And I trusted her and said, sure, I'll do whatever. And she took me to this lady's house. We knocked on the door and it was an Indian yoga teacher the way that yoga worked there was you arrived whenever you arrived, and whenever you arrived was fine. They took all the furniture out of the lounge. It was a fairly small house. And they would put the furniture outside and you would do yoga. So you could arrive at 3 p.m, you could arrive at 5. There were no classes. And whoever you brought did yoga with you, and she would teach. And she would teach for an hour or an hour and a half. And it was just the most amazing, really interesting, pretty eclectic environment, a very well-studied teacher. And so I've had these cool experiences all around the world, which has been part of the joy of travel and of meeting different people and experiencing different types of yoga and seeing how yoga is part of people's lives in different ways. I think a lot of people think that yoga teachers are of a very one-cut mold, very Lululemon and perfect and no pimples. And my yoga life has been very eclectic and has ebbed and flowed. It has changed a lot during my life. And it's been part of the joy, is that it's something that comes with you no matter where you go.
I couldn't agree more. It is something that does ebb and flow even with the seasons, or it can also be with the weeks or the years. It's a beautiful thing to allow to have that fluidity to it, to not always need that rigidity and structure that I think people can also picture, that Ashtanga, that very, structured style practice. But I wanted to also agree with you on a huge level about the gift that yoga gives of connection worldwide. A huge, of course, pillar of this podcast and of what I do is trying to connect with yoga teachers around the world. And it's something that I've also found in my travels or in my work or in my life is it's such a gorgeous tool of connection. Like your story in Botswana at that yoga teacher's house, it just filled my heart with so much joy. That's such a beautiful story. Did you practice with her for a long time, or do you have another story like that you'd want to share?
I was a little eclectic in Botswana, if I'm very honest. That was at the earlier stage of my connection with yoga, so I wasn't as regular. But it was very unique in how welcoming and how open and how absolutely just a part of the experience of higgly-piggly life. You turn up at someone's house, she's let's get all the furniture out and do yoga. It was interesting. I have enjoyed yoga in many countries. I had a wonderful experience in Sri Lanka. I was going for a walk and came to a temple up on the top of a hill and met a really incredible yoga teacher who, of course, has no bio and doesn't have a Facebook page and barely speaks English, and had a most wonderful couple of sessions with him. And you're right, it's a practice that helps us to connect with other people and in a way that's really grounding and meaningful and very open. So that's really something I love. Everywhere I travel to, pretty much, I have had some really lovely yoga experiences. And I think particularly outside of the Western environment, where it's very class-based, very regulated, very structured, sometimes you find these little gems of experience that are very authentic and very raw. They're not as structured as we would expect in a city. I've had some very interesting classes in India turning up at places where, of course, no one speaks English and they don't expect a white person, and it can be very fun.
Yes, it is always that delight and that surprise. I also wanted to ask you, Nicola, how did you get started with the Vanuatu Yoga Association? How did that come to fruition or come to be something you were co-founding?
That's a great question. So I really have to give the credit to starting that to a lovely teacher and very dear friend of mine called Katie Hamilton King, a woman originally from New Zealand. So she came here a little while before me. Her husband had work in Vanuatu and she came with her family and kids, and she is a yoga teacher of second generation. Her mum's also a teacher, and she came to Vanuatu and she found an existing class that was going, a French woman called Pascal, who had started a class here. I don't think Pascal was qualified, I'm not sure. And she had started a social yoga group. And Pascal was leaving the country, so Katie then continued with that. And Katie really, as a qualified and very experienced teacher, really brought together the first yoga tribe and the first community of students, and established regular classes and started to rent facilities and things like that. And in Vanuatu, it's quite complex. The environment of setting up a business as a foreigner can be quite complicated. And so the Yoga Association was a joining between Katie, and then I arrived, and a wonderful woman called Jen. And Jen was in Vanuatu doing legal work. She was assisting the government with legal advice. She's a lawyer. And it was Jen's idea to say, let's make it, if it's not for profit, then it's easier to establish an association and we can set up the infrastructure that way, and it makes everything legal. And we dreamed up the idea of, let's just for the short term at the beginning see if it works as a voluntary association. So we don't have set fees. We do have recommended rates, but people can pay anything they wish to pay, and if they don't have money, they don't need to pay. And that's just absolutely amazingly worked for such a long time. We've managed to pay our rent, we've paid all our outgoings, we've bought equipment for various studios, and it's just been amazing that trusting in the goodness of people and trusting that something that doesn't seem to be commercially logical can work. So it's been great.
That's huge. That is so huge that you, Katie, and Jen, the three of you came together and dreamed up this idea together. Nicola, I'd love to ask also, how many yoga studios is part of the Yoga Association, and does it cover the entire island? And I think there might be up to 80 islands in Vanuatu, so maybe you're even on other ones besides Port Vila. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, sure. We're very focused on Port Vila, actually, because that's where we live and where we spend our time. So the association will help and support and assist. So, for example, there's a wonderful lady who's teaching on one of the other islands called Santo, and she often comes to Vila. So when she comes to Vila, we share her information and promote her weekends or whatever courses she's doing. So we do help each other and hope to facilitate yoga in the country. We ourselves run just the one, and we are a little bit the ever orphans. We do move around a bit in terms of the actual physical space. Port Vila is a very small capital city, but the real estate's very expensive, so that has caused us a few little hiccups along the road, that we've moved a bit from one location to another location, and trying to find our forever home has been a little challenging. It's a very touristy town too, so places with a view over the water, it's a very pretty town, are very expensive. So while the association's worked really well, it doesn't necessarily afford us to resort style facilities in terms of an actual physical room. So we do move quite a bit. We're a bit of a virtual yoga studio, but we have a wonderful new home, which is at a kiteboarding school, very close to the sea, so we can see the sea in the distance, and we look over coconut palms, and it's really beautiful. So we're very grateful to the Kiteboarding School for welcoming us. We hang out in a little loft, which suits us because our community has actually gotten a lot smaller during the COVID period. In Vanuatu, we've had our borders completely closed for nearly 2.5 years. So the community has become very small, and so a little studio overlooking the sea is just a blessing.
I love the idea of being in a little loft above a kiteboarding school. That's so sweet. Oh, I love it when things come together and merge and have that fusion with nature or another type of way to move our bodies or to challenge ourselves, because kiteboarding is extremely difficult.
One thing we love about the kiteboarding school is, yes, like-minded people that are into outdoors and expression and movement and balance. And there are some facilities that are being set up there about balance and about skateboarding, and there's just, hopefully it's going to be a partnership made in heaven. We've just started there, but we're very optimistic.
I think that just sounds like the dream. And so has the borders opened yet?
Unfortunately, we've just had our first wave of COVID, and I myself had COVID a week ago, or just over a week ago. So we're going through a bit of our COVID period that perhaps the rest of the world felt a year or two ago, and it's affecting us now.
Yikes. Yeah, it has been a tough road, but I'm happy you sound well. You recovered well from COVID?
Yeah, bounced back great. Really good. Almost like a light switch turned back on after a couple of little bit tough days, but came back really well, which was good.
Great. And so also I would love to talk to you about how the local community responded to the yoga association being founded or the offering of classes. Was there curiosity? How was the response, would you say?
Generally very warm and welcoming. So the people in Vanuatu are called Ni Vanuatu, and the community is very lovely, very peaceful. The mentality of the people here connect very well with the philosophy or ethos of yoga. The people are very community minded. They're very welcoming. They're very respectful. People are very peaceful. They believe more in harmony amongst people is more important than your own particular individualistic will. So we live in this beautiful community that we have just felt very welcome. It's been really interesting introducing some Ni Vanuatu to yoga classes. There's some very interesting questions because in many parts of the world, everyone conceptually understands or has some idea of what yoga is, whereas here, the questions often sneak in, perhaps in Messenger, as is yoga a form of exercise? Do you need to wear trainers, special trainers? There's just no concept really very much about what yoga is. So that's been really interesting.
Absolutely. And so have you had a lot of people coming in for just one class and reacting with complete surprise? Oh, wow, I thought that was going to be a cardio class. Or has there been any stories like that?
A little bit. Part of the interesting dynamics to Vanuatu is it's a very multilingual country. So we have 3 official languages, which are French, English, and Pidgin language called Bishlama. And then there are over 100 other languages. So it can be very interesting when someone walks in the door to know how to greet them or what to say. And that throws another dynamic. But as your yoga is very good because people follow along. You don't really need to understand the words terribly much to get started, and then the rest comes after that. But yeah, we have a very fun time here, and it's a very wonderful place to live and to practice. It's very green. It's a very natural environment. When people ask me to describe Vanuatu, sometimes I say it's like Costa Rica, but 30 years ago. So we're very pristine. Most people in Vanuatu don't live with electricity. Many don't live with running water. So we live with gardens and farming and palms. It's very green. It's very natural, which is wonderful.
Definitely a slice of paradise. Wow, to have that lack of electricity and hums and all of that noise. Nikki, I love how you mentioned that you feel that the community of Vanuatu isn't quite sure maybe what yoga is. There's not that kind of preconceived notion that a lot of people maybe in the West have that kind of cookie cutter idea already in their pocket. So I love to ask every yoga teacher that I interview, what is their personal definition of yoga? What does yoga mean to you, or how do you define it?
For me, yoga is a coming home. It's very much a coming home to myself. So I think the world pulls us in many different directions. And for me, the quietness of when I step onto a mat, whether it's for 10 minutes or whether it's for an hour or no matter what I do, it's immediately a reconnecting, and it's a reconnecting to my true self. So it's very much about resetting, reestablishing. It's about being true, and that truth changes as well. So yoga, for me, I'm now 47. So as a 47-year-old, yoga is a different type of experience, but it's no less and it's no better and it's no more than it was when I was 23. To me, the main thing I think about when I think to try and define yoga, it's a coming home to myself. It's a stepping back into who I really am. It's a truthfulness.
I love that. I love that. I also agree in that sense of coming back to self, how I love that yoga is such an internal experience. It has so very little to do with the external environment or the external circumstances. It's about listening very deeply to our mind, our body, and our energy. I think that there's so much to learn every time I also do any of the yoga practices, whether it's just sitting still for 5 minutes and breathing, or laying down for 10 minutes in butterfly. It doesn't have to be a full practice of any size or shape.
Yoga exists in our real world. I find some of the Instagram impressions of yoga is of silence and absolute picture book beauty. And to be honest, for me, that's not yoga necessarily. You could be completely disconnected in the most beautiful environment. Yoga exists with bumps and warts and farts, and it exists in the real world. It doesn't exist in this metaphorical make-believe. And I guess that would be one of the misunderstandings of yoga that I think people bring, and perhaps it's a very Western attitude that we have to be perfect. The perfect yoga pants and the perfect environment and the white studio. This idea of perfection, and Vanuatu is a very natural world, which means it's higgly-piggly and things go wrong. Nothing's perfect here, and yoga to me is like that too. It doesn't need to be perfection. It's not a cartoon. It's not a Hollywood creation. It's much more real and much more authentic, which is definitely what you get in a yoga class in Vanuatu. Vanuatu is very famous for expect the unexpected. It's a very raw world, and we've had some funny experiences. We had a yoga studio that had very big windows, and we had people taking shortcuts through the studio, walking through the window, which was very funny, thinking it was completely fine to walk through the yoga studio by stepping through the window. We have existed above a dentist shop and heard people drilling out teeth while we were meditating. We've had all sorts of hilarious experiences. It's definitely very real world. It's not picture book. I don't know quite how to describe that, but yeah.
No, I think you nailed it. I think the walking through the window in the middle of a yoga class, and then also dentist drilling in the background. I think those are very vivid examples, Nikki. Yeah. I love it.
We were in a basement of a gym, and we had people dropping gear, like big heavy weights, and we're in the middle of a meditation and there's this ba-boom. So we definitely exist in the very messy real world, but I find that is one of the humorous parts of yoga. A good yoga teacher has a sense of humor, I feel, and Vanuatu is very humbling. It brings you back to reality. If you're trying to do the Hollywood style, very glamorous Instagram yoga, you might struggle a little.
Oh, I think that having a sense of humor is such a huge gift that you get from yoga as well. That lesson of not holding on to things so tightly, not just the conception of perfection, but even the conception of, there's
Class
a million examples running through my head. Yeah, or anything, or just in our own sense of our ego, not gripping things so tightly, or our sense of control in the workplace. It's just that softening, that smiling, that just okay, this is all right.
Let's see where this is going to go. Yeah.
Yeah. And so also, Nikki, I wanted to make sure I wanted to learn a little bit more about the challenges of teaching on a small island that I know pre-COVID had such a transient nature of all the teachers. And I'm sure there's, as you mentioned, challenges to find the space on such a small island. So can you talk to us more about what that's like?
The more transient nature of the teachers can be seen as a challenge, but it can also be a real gift. Definitely never lack for interesting people that come through. They don't always stay very long. Vanuatu can be a place where someone tries to set up a business or tries to come and work in an area, or there's a lot of transient jobs. There's a high percentage of NGO work, so non-government organisations or aid work. So people might come in on a contract for 3 months, and we've met the most amazing and wonderful teachers and had so many people volunteer their time, which has been really lovely. On the flip side of that, I guess schedules change a lot and there's a lot of coming and going of teachers. One of the challenges here is, I touched on it earlier, that as a foreigner to set up a business can be a bit complicated. It's not impossible. So that has definitely probably slowed down the commercialization of yoga. We do have a couple of commercial yoga studios and we really welcome them, because at the beginning, right up until very recently, the Yoga Association has been the only consistent source of yoga in Vanuatu. We've had no other studios, but there is a studio that's just started in town, and there's one in another island called Santo. And it's wonderful to see the opportunities for yoga growing here. I think in terms of a location for retreats, because of the natural beauty, that's something that we might see. But definitely there is a little bit of a long process in setting up a business. So that has been a bit of a barrier. But given our nonprofit approach, it's not actually been an issue for us, but it would be challenging to set up a commercial yoga studio. The other thing too is we're a very small population. So in any place in the world, only a percentage of people of the general population will become regular yoga studios. So with the population being so small, our country is less than 300,000 people in total across 80 islands. So even on this island, the capital, there's less than 40,000 people. So we have a very small pool of clients or yogis. And so that probably naturally keeps things pretty small and quiet.
That's good to hear more about how it's challenging, but it's also rewarding. And I love to hear that there are 2 more studios popping up, and that, as you mentioned, I guess some have come and gone, but maybe they're here to stay, hopefully.
Yeah, the people that stay here the longest and where it usually works well for someone that's new, that's overseas born, that wants to make a life here, is if you're very multifaceted. So you might not teach yoga 16 classes a week. You might teach yoga and on the side be a gym instructor, and then in the daytime have a job at a bank. It means we attract really interesting people that have multiple skills, and it means we can live a life where we don't just do one thing, which I think is a blessing as well.
What is your other job, Nikki?
I have a couple.
Fill me in.
At the moment, I work for the Chamber of Commerce, so I manage a number of different projects. I have a Women in Business project, and I have a blockchain project that's around distribution of money to people in need after natural disasters. And I manage a kind of a skills centre where we upskill adults that are in the business community. So that's one of my hats. I also have a small retail store and love working with natural artisanal products. So I love the weaving. We have beautiful weaving in Vanuatu and really lovely skills and providing an environment where people can commercialise some of those skills. My husband and I have built a marina. So we manage a marina, which is the Point Marina. It's a place where we welcome people to live right next to the sea if you're into water sports. And I also have a marketing business. So perhaps I have too many hats, but it makes for a very interesting variety.
Yeah, but it's not quite like as complimentary as other people say of hats. Like I'm a photographer and a videographer and a graphic designer. I'm like, okay, they're all in the same like little realm, but you're like marketing and blockchain and local artisanal goods.
I come from a family of artists. So my mum and my sister and my granddad are artists. So that's where the local products and working with weavers and textiles and that sort of thing comes from. And my background was technology. So I used to work in telecommunications and had a really busy career setting up mobile phone networks and rebranding and things like that. So that's where the blockchain stuff comes from. And I love business. I think business provides a lot of opportunities for people, a lot of pride, a lot of learning, and love my work with the Chamber of Commerce. So yeah, I do lots of different things, which is really lovely and perhaps why I need the yoga so much. So that I have a roost. I come home to myself on the mat.
Amazing. And yeah, the telecommunications, sitting at a desk, doing mobile phone lines. Yeah, that's a hustle, isn't it?
Yeah, it has been. It's afforded me a really interesting life because I traveled a lot for work, but it's a very different world. Phones are such a given now. Anyway, we're going sideways there, but yeah.
A little bit. Okay, so I would also like to know, where do you envision your association going in the future? Do you have a goal set up or a dream with Katie and Jen, or is it just exactly as it is, perfect, and you're content with this kind of fluidity and change?
It's an interesting question. I think we're very open to change. We are very relaxed. So we don't have stiff goals. There are no rules. We've always managed a very fluid, loose arrangements, have gone with the flow, have changed as things change. And as we see studios starting up, the non-profit angle can be a competitive barrier, perhaps. So if you were a very motivated, young, new person wanting to establish a studio, to have teachers who are very established offering the classes for close to free, it makes the business model of a commercial studio more difficult. So we feel there may be a time when the association will sit back and become more a community website, or leave the market more open to people who want to earn a living from yoga, which is happy and sad at the same time. I think it's a natural evolution as yoga grows around the world. Yoga teachers need to also make a living. So if your skill set was very strong in yoga and you wanted that to be your entire life and your world and your business, then if we found people like that were very committed, I think we would step back a little bit. So it's an interesting question, and that may be seen differently by different people, but we're very relaxed with that. We feel it's just how things change over time.
Beautiful. Do you have any advice you would like to offer to someone who wanted to start out their yoga journey or studio ownership? Anything like that?
Not so much advice, apart from perhaps just the importance of not putting too much pressure on yourself. So I see a lot of people that are desperate to get into a complicated pose, or as I have matured in my practice and in my life, I see the grace in, while it's great to have ambition, I see a lot of people hurting themselves with their ambition and their ego. And perhaps these are some of the basics of yoga, but the older I get, the more I come back to some of the fundamentals, and learning to accept yourself and your body and your practice as part of who you are, and not needing to achieve a specific pose or a specific outcome, and not being too hard on ourselves. I think as societies evolve, we have very high expectations of ourselves. And I think there is a real grace in, one of the lessons I've learned recently is the practice evolves with your life. When I had COVID, my practice was breathing. And when I had COVID, my practice was not responding, to let things pass. So yoga can come with us on that journey. And I hope that I'd like to encourage people to let it be a natural evolution and not push too hard. That's something that I think about and try to encourage my students.
I think it's important for our listeners to hear and to remember that it isn't about that ego or that ambitious pose goal. It can be a very humbling experience to try to learn a new pose or get there if we can have that perspective of humility and of allowing. But it can be hard to when students say, how many weeks, how many days until I can do XYZ? It's sad because it isn't about getting into a shape. That doesn't make your yoga practice better.
And that's so hard to teach, isn't it? Like today, I had a practice today and with a few fellow yogis outside, and I did cow face pose, which after 20 years of yoga, I am so bad at cow face pose. It is hilarious. And I think that's part of being okay with not being perfect. And yoga teachers, perhaps, I think we can all learn to come to the mat with what we have, and that's enough.
It is. It definitely is enough. And I'm grateful that you brought that up. So thank you, Nikki, for sharing it. And if our listeners do want to get to know you better, is there a good link or a good place for them to find you? I'll put everything in the show notes, but I just wasn't sure if you wanted to say to our listeners how they can best find you.
We are better at responding on Facebook. So we are not super technical. We exist in a world that's face-to-face, and word of mouth is how we do a lot of our promotion and so on. But we are reasonably good at Facebook. So if anyone's coming to Vanuatu, please contact us on Facebook. We'll happily share where we're teaching, and we welcome any visitors, and visiting teachers are very welcome too. So we'd love to see you as soon as the borders open up, which hopefully should be in July this year. We would love to see anyone that wants to come and practice or share their gift of yoga with us. We would love that.
Amazing. So thank you so much, Nikki, for being with me on the show today. It's been a joy to be with you.
And thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Wild Yoga Tribe podcast. My conversation with Nicola Barnes, a yoga teacher from Vanuatu, was so delightful as we took a deep dive into the world of yoga association formation in Vanuatu. And also, we discussed how yoga is an art and an act of coming home. I hope that this conversation made you curious about balance and movement and expression, as well as the act of coming home to yourself without pressure, without ego, without ambition, just coming home. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Wild Yoga Tribe podcast. Be well. Thank you for the gift of your attention today. If you feel called, please share this episode with someone who you think could benefit from it. Leaving a review would also be so appreciated. I also hope you can join me online on my website, wildyogatribe.com, or on social media. I would love to get to know you better. I would love to share with you and to hear your thoughts. Send me a DM, send me a note, get in touch. It would be great to hear from you. And as always, be well, dear one, be well.